welcome to another episode of the 8-Bit Guy. Today I'm going to be looking into restoring some old cartridge games. Now I'm sure we all have an old cartridge around somewhere that looks tacky, and I didn't pay very much for these. I got both of these in a lot, so it's not like I specifically picked these cartridges out of anything, but they look terrible. The label on this one is, I honestly couldn't even tell what game it was at first, but apparently this is WrestleMania, and this old Pitfall cartridge for the Atari 2600 looks pretty tacky too. Now both of these cartridges actually work, but this one for the Nintendo requires putting it in and taking it out several times before I can get it to work, and I can look in here and see that it's actually really dusty in there. So one of the things I'm going to do, besides just trying to relabel it, is to clean them as well and make them both work like new and look like new. Now I have a few different ways I'm going to experiment with this. First of all, I should mention I have not been able to find any scanned or original copies of these labels for me to print out. So I'm going to actually try to recreate them myself in a paint program and see what I can come up with. And then I'm going to print them out, and I'm going to try 3 different ways. I'm going to try just printing them like on these Avery shipping labels and seeing how that works. I'm also going to just try regular paper and using this spray adhesive. And then I'm also going to try rubber cement and see which one of these works best for making the label stick to the cartridge. And then of course I'm going to take these apart and clean them.
So the first thing I needed to do was come up with new labels. I didn't film any of my work in the paint program, but I did save my work many times along the way. I started with measuring the aspect ratio of the original cartridge, and I found an Activision logo on the internet, which saved me some time drawing it. I drew the Pitfall logo by hand, and then I just found a visually similar font for the rest of this text. I also drew the little monitor screen by hand. It was actually kind of fun drawing all the little details of the game screen, and surprisingly it wasn't that hard since the graphics are so simple. At this point I was still doing all of this by eye. And this was my finished result. In total, I think this took me about 30 minutes to draw. So I printed it out on my laser printer and compared it with the real thing. I could immediately see a few tweaks that I needed to make, the main thing being the colors, but also the size and position of a few things. So I began to change some of the things around, and then I printed out a second test. And this one was much closer, but still needed a few minor tweaks. Next, it was time to move on to WrestleMania. Now, this cartridge was in such bad shape that I had to find a scan online just to look at to see what it's supposed to look like. Unfortunately, the scan is not high resolution enough for me to use as a new label. Now, obviously, I can't draw Hulk Hogan, but I did a Google search for Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off, and I managed to find essentially the same photo. I also found the Acclaim logo, the Nintendo logos, and the WrestleMania logo. So I started with the original scan here as a guide, and then I overlaid the photo of Hulk Hogan. By the way, is he a clone or something? Because I noticed he doesn't have a belly button. Anyway, next I started adding in the logos at the bottom. Now I had to do something about the top. I couldn't find any photo of Hulk Hogan that had all of the extra headroom of the original, so what I just did was extend the background all the way to the top. It's a little noticeable here, but once I put the WrestleMania logo over the top, it seemed less noticeable. And here's my final version. All in all, this probably took less time to make than the Pitfall label. The next thing I needed to do was determine which type of adhesive I should use to stick the labels to the cartridge.
I looked around the house for something made of ABS or polycarbonate plastic, basically something that should be really similar material to the cartridge shells.
I found this old iBook G3 cover from my days repairing these things, and this should work fine. The first test will be using these Avery shipping labels. I'll just run one through the printer, then cut it out, and then apply it to the plastic. One thing I noticed right away was that some of the toner was already coming off. This is probably due to my printer not producing enough heat for these thicker labels. I might also be able to solve that by changing some settings, but for the moment it's good enough because I'm just interested in how well it sticks. Next I tried this spray adhesive. I've never used this stuff before, so here goes. Okay, well that seems to be stuck on there. And last, I tried this rubber cement. Again, I've never used this stuff before. Well, I just wanted a thin layer, but it turns out a little goes a long way. In fact, too long. I had to wipe some of it off, and that actually left a nice thin layer of the stuff. Alright, so I need to let this stuff sit for a while, so I'll come back and check on these later.
I'd also also like to mention that when I do these restoration videos, there's always somebody in the comments complaining that I should have just left it the way it was. You know, I'm destroying history or something like that. And, you know, I just have a few things to say about that. First of all, everybody has their own opinion, of course. But even when you look at classic cars, I mean, is it wrong to take an old rusty classic car from the 1950s and repaint it so that it looks new? I don't think you'd find too many people that argue with that. Yet at the same time, take an old coin from 100 years ago. If it's all tarnished, some people say, oh, well, you shouldn't clean that because it's better for it to look tarnished and ugly like it, you know, is old. And then other people say, oh, well, no, you want to clean it up and make it look like it's new. There's opinions on both sides. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that these are my cartridges. I can do whatever I want to with them. I can roll them over with a steamroller if I want. And I have done that in a previous episode for those who haven't seen it. So, you know, these are going to stay in my collection. Maybe someday when I'm old and gray, maybe I'll sell them off. But for the time being, they're mine. I want them to look nice. So, by golly, I'm going to see what I can do to make that happen.
The next thing I needed to do was remove the original labels. My first go-to product for this is WD-40. A lot of people ask why I don't use this or that product, but I've found WD-40 often works really well and is very gentle, meaning it doesn't eat the plastic and it doesn't stink up the room like some of the more noxious chemicals do. However, it doesn't always work. The key is, of course, you have to let it sit for at least 10 minutes for the best result. So I came back to this after 10 minutes and tried to remove the label from the WrestleMania. As you can see, it didn't help much. This label was going to be stubborn. I was just not having any luck getting this thing off, so I put it aside for the moment and checked on the pitfall label. Now see, when WD-40 works, it works very well, and this is the result I expect most of the time. All that I needed to do now was dry off the WD-40. And as expected, there was still some lingering adhesive residue. Alcohol is usually my go-to product for this sort of job, and as expected, it did a great job of removing the rest of the residue, leaving me with a very clean surface on this cartridge. So back to the other one. I got out the hairdryer. Sometimes heat will cause adhesives to loosen up. I worked on this for a while, but still no luck. However, I could tell that the WD-40 had at least degraded the adhesive and the paper, so I gave up and just used a screwdriver. The key is you need a screwdriver that's kind of dull from years of use. That way it doesn't have any real sharp edges that will dig into the plastic. It just sort of pushes the label off. This is kind of tedious, but after 2 or 3 minutes I managed to get most of the label off, leaving just this residue behind. I followed that up with some alcohol to finish the job. Unfortunately, the screwdriver left some scratches, but they're not deep and I can't even feel them with my finger, so the new label should hide these completely. Since I've removed the labels, I might as well take these cartridges apart and clean them. I mean, just look at all of the crud in this WrestleMania cartridge. Many cartridges hide the screws under the label, so this is a perfect time to do it. NES cartridges do require a special tool. I bought this one on eBay for like $2. It'll work on the vast majority of NES cartridges since they're all the same design. Here's what the funky little screws look like when you get them out. Oddly enough, the corrosion on the contacts is fairly mild. On the other hand, look at this pitfall cartridge. These contacts have a good bit of oxidation on them. I'm also going to clean the plastics, so I'll remove these little spring thingamajigs. Rinsing in the sink is probably the easiest way to clean these. However, this one had some really stubborn gunk, almost like somebody spilled soda in this or something. So I had to come back with a brush and clean this gunk out. This is also a good time to clean all of those little grooves. And next, the pitfall cartridge. Okay, so there are many ways to clean these contacts that work, but I found the fastest and most effective way is to use baking soda. I just sprinkle some on and then I get my little brush wet and I come back and lightly scrub the contacts for about 30 seconds. Then just rinse it off in the sink. When I do this pitfall cartridge, I'm just going to scrub the right side of it only so you can see the difference it makes. So take a look now. You can see where I cleaned the right contacts but not the left. In fact, take a look at this photo I took before cleaning and then this one I took after.
I've actually had cartridges before that flat out would not work at all, and then cleaning them like this restored them to working order.
Well, it was time to start reassembling these things. I did let everything dry out for a few hours before putting it back together because you definitely don't want to trap a bunch of moisture inside these housings. It was just about time to go back to my adhesive test and find out which method was going to work best.
Alright, so it's been a few hours, and I'm going to take a look at these and see. So this was the one that was printed on the Avery label. And one of the things I noticed about this one right away is it feels very rough. And these feel very smooth. And I think that's because the toner was never properly melted on this. And again, that's why I can kind of rub it off. So, but just as far as the label goes, let's see how well it sticks. Well, I'd say it sticks pretty well. It definitely doesn't want to come off. So, I don't think adhesion would be a problem. So, this is the one that we use the spray adhesive on. Let's see if I can pull that off. Okay, well, I think maybe I just didn't get that. Okay, and this is the one with the rubber cement. Okay, so I guess that answers that. So the Avery label had the best adhesion, and then this was like the second best adhesion, and then the rubber cement was the worst. So I had another crazy idea while I was getting ready to do this. I kept thinking of some way I could give these labels a glossy finish and kind of a protective coating that would protect them from liquid or the oil on my fingers or other things like that.
And I realized packing tape might work, so I tried laying the tape over the printed label. Unfortunately, it turns out my tape wasn't wide enough, so I had to use two pieces and try to lay them side by side. Then I used some scissors to cut the label out, and you know what? I think the finished label looks pretty darn good. I did the same with the Pitfall label, and I think it looks good too. For various reasons, I decided to go with the spray adhesive. I decided to use masking tape to mask off any areas of the cartridge that I didn't want to become sticky. And here it is, completely masked and ready for adhesive. Now, I made a mistake here. I was in a hurry to get this label on because I thought this stuff was time sensitive. However, once I started putting it on, I could see the liquid was saturating the paper and bleeding through. So, as annoying as it was, I decided to take it back off. I used some alcohol to clean the surface again. So, here it is, all ready for a second try. I realized at this point that the proper way to use this spray is to let it sit for at least a good 30 seconds before you try to stick something to it. So, here's the old label that I screwed up. And here's another one that I just printed. So, here goes take two. Another problem I ran into is that the rest of the cartridge with the masking tape was extremely sticky, and that stuff wanted to stay on my fingers. I was worried about accidentally transferring the sticky stuff to the top of the new label, which I didn't want. It was quite a pain, but I managed to do it. All I had to do now was just remove the masking tape. And here's the finished product. I got to work on the WrestleMania cartridge, only I had an idea that might make this go a little smoother. Okay, so it was all masked off and time for the spray adhesive. What I did different this time was I decided to remove the masking tape before applying the label. That way there would be nothing sticky on the cartridge except for the one place I needed it to be. And that actually worked out much better. After all, this whole thing was a learning experience for me. And here's the finished WrestleMania cartridge. Again, I'm quite impressed with my own work here.
So I actually took these two games and showed them to a few of my friends, and I asked them if they could notice anything unusual about them without telling them, what I did to them, and they actually didn't notice anything unusual. So I would definitely say that these labels hold up to at least casual scrutiny. So one thing I can mention about this process, and let's be honest, I could have bought, say, another Pitfall cartridge on eBay for like $5. It would probably be in better condition than the one I restored. So spending several hours messing with this was probably not a productive use of my time. But I should point out that a lot of the time I spent was a learning process, and if I were to do this again, I could do it actually quite a bit faster because I already know exactly what works and what doesn't work. I'd also like to point out that there are some cartridges where you can find a decent copy of the label, like a good scan of it online, and that would also save you a lot of time from having to recreate the labels. But there are certainly some rare cartridges out there that could stand to use new labels and would definitely be worth it to do that.
And there's no reason you couldn't use the same process to create nice new labels for old floppy disks like these either.
I suspect I'm going to wind up probably doing at least another dozen of my games over the next month or two as time allows. Of course, I'll be concentrating on those in the worst condition. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, so stick around for the next one, and thanks for watching.